So next up, and I tend not to like these reports because I find they're you know margin of error is plus or minus 100%. But this is a nice one from the guys at Nvidia. Well, surprisingly, Nvidia doing an AI in financial services report, which I found was kind of strange. But
Why did you
nevertheless,
find that strange?
sorry.
Why did you find that strange?
But just, I mean, you would expect this from one of the big four consultancies, not a chip maker. But Nvidia, obviously, they're a big thread for them is AI chips. So it's unsurprising they went ahead and did this.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's why I think this is quite a useful piece of information.
I think they
Um,
actually have more on the ground, real insight into what's happening in financial services than the big consulting firms because they're in the heart
yeah,
of most of those systems.
it's possible. It's possible. Certainly, I mean, although kind of on the enterprise side, you don't get to see kind of down to the metal too much.
Mm-hmm.
It tends to be a few steps away from you.
Right.
But this had a few interesting nuggets. Obviously, so I know, reducing fraud has been the key for financial services from day one with AI,
Right.
principally because they were forced to do it by the regulator
Mm-hmm.
after the financial meltdown in 2007, 2008. And being fined $12 billion a year is a great push to make you go into reducing that. And interestingly, for that particular use case, it could only be done with AI or hiring 4,000 people, which nobody wanted to do. But a couple of things I found I thought was interesting. Just looking at some of their use cases, I just mentioned that, even though I don't tend to like the word use case. Obviously, fraud across banking, fraud, AI, AML, and KYC is the key thing for those that don't know. That's anti-money laundering and know your customer. And that's because they're regulated and they're forced to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was interesting to see their review of that. But what I really thought was interesting is when they looked at overcoming challenges, and this was just reiterating what I always already think is the case anyway, and know. But interestingly, they looked at biggest challenges in achieving your AI goals by role. So they looked at leadership and kind of on the engineering side, which is, I think, where they would tend to focus more, being kind of the chip people. Lack of budget, too few data scientists, lack of data. What I would say there, actually, from the executive side or leadership side, I think when they say too few data scientists, what they're actually really saying is too little experience. And that for them, a data scientist is a proxy for their experience. So I think what they're saying is, if we had all these data scientists, then we would know what to do. But it's not actually the data scientist that's the issue, it's the knowing what to do that's the issue.
Yeah.
So I think it's more like lack of expertise, lack of budget, and lack of data.
On the executive leadership side. So lack of budget, I understand. You and I have talked a lot about this. If you don't have a program of record, I haven't built a program of record, said this is a long-term transformation, like in your body of work and your coursework, you often talk about there's the digital transfer or the digital transformation, the data transformation, and that this is kind of a 10-year AI 10-year plus AI transformation. If they're not thinking that way, then they don't have programs of record with associated budgets. It just becomes point project budgets. Oh, fix this thing, do this task, fix this form. Oh, make this transaction run a little bit faster. So I get where the lack of budget is coming from, right? Because they're not pooling their budgets. They're not working across. They're not saying, one of the things you've said before is don't solve this, optical character recognition, form reading exercise for this one department, solve it for 50 departments at the same time, then pool the budget. So I think it kind of goes to the heart of what you talk a lot about, which is making better use of the internal funds to solve not one case, but a case that's horizontal across the enterprise.
Solve the capability,
Solve
not
for the
the,
capability, not for the points case. Yeah.
yeah.
The too few data scientists, I call, BS on that. And I think what that translates to is not too few data scientists. It's we don't have the team. Broadly speaking, we don't have the team. We don't have AI leaders in place who understand the technology. We don't understand how to structure a team, how to attract that talent. Yeah, there are data scientists, but what about the machine learning engineers? What about the user interface people? What about the people who know to do program management, product management, who know how to build the platforms that all this stuff sits on? It's essentially a team problem. You
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
attract and retain the right talent. So for them to say we don't have enough data scientists, I think is
I think
naive.
data scientist that gets used as shorthand, doesn't it?
I think
For
so. I
the
think
guys that
for
know
all
this
the
stuff.
people, yeah, for all the people who need to, we need to have on board in order to build these things. Cassie Kozyrkov, I think she's still over at Google, but she talks about like all of the number of people that you have to have on your team in a large scale team to build these things successfully. And I think there are 9 or 10 roles. So I think, yes, you're right. It gets used as a shorthand for actually people who know how to build systems and apps and services. The lack of data is interesting because we're talking about, financial services companies. They have lots and lots of data. And that's a whole separate topic, right? There's a big push, Andrew Ng from landing.ai and many others pushing, saying this push for more data isn't necessarily the path forward because more data is expensive. And more data has to be labeled and more data has to be cleaned. So
What I've
I'm
always
not buying
Yeah,
these
what
arguments.
I've
I think
always
they
found
survey
with
these
the
execs.
lack of data is it's not lack of data, it's lack of access to data.
That can be another problem. They may not have the rights or the legal use, or they may just get blocked from some other executive saying you can't have access to it. It's my idea.
And that's often the case.
It's a big problem. Yeah.
So let's scroll down and look at something else that you'll have a much better idea of than I have. But
Well,
it's
so
interesting to see this.
yeah, let's chop that piece. I'll just do this every time there's an edit. Let's cover the right column because I think there's a bunch of interesting stuff there too.
Okay. Well, why don't you jump in there? Because I'm not sure. Um, oh, well, let me just start by just saying something quickly then, because I don't have much there. So looking at what they think about from or the feedback they've got from developers slash IT slash others, whoever the others are. Of course, the infrastructure is a key one. And I think that crosses not just core IT infrastructure, but obviously the data infrastructure as well. They note also lack of data and too few data scientists. So it's interesting they map those two the same. I thought developers would have had a bunch of different things that they're thinking about. Obviously, infrastructure is one, but what do you think about that?
I think I need to go back and look at the source survey of this report because this seems grossly simplistic and oversimplified. And I don't think that's in line with Nvidia. Nvidia is a very talented company and they do a lot of great work. So I need to go look at the source report. To me, poor technology infrastructure makes sense. And I think you can think of that as an AI ML platform infrastructure issue. In other words, do we have an ML platform that sort of lets us go from collecting data through to cleaning it, prepping it, transforming it, turning, getting features built in for the models, and then essentially being able to do this iterative model training process and validation of the model and benchmarking and all the things that happen kind of in the model development and training stage, all the way through to, okay, now we're going to eventually say it passes, it meets the bar and we're going to go to production and then we're going to put it into production. We're going to monitor it and we're going to make sure it still stays accurate, still stays performant, and it's not costing us too much to run it. And at what point do we then, either kill it in the future and, kind of decommission it or replace it with something later? And that whole life cycle starts again. The infrastructure to manage that is in flux. It's being developed, right? The ML platforms, there's a lot of conversations. There are a lot of conversations in conferences and things that I'm involved with and others are involved with to try to build that tech stack. And it's not, it's just being developed. It's emerging right now. So I agree very strongly that that's totally true. I don't think that the developers and the IT team care about a lack of data. That's not their job. They mostly care about, do we have the platform? Do we have the app? Does it control our infrastructure or our cloud infrastructure? Can it spin up servers? Do we have storage? They kind of care more about that. And I think that the earlier point, it says too few data scientists. The developers and the IT team don't care about that. They care about machine learning engineers. So I think you're right that data scientist is sort of being used to mean all of the people on the team that we need.
The catch-all.
It's a catch-all, yeah.
So let's take a look at this one, which I thought was particularly interesting, where financial service companies run their AI workload, and interesting to see the progress there from 34% on premise. That's encouraging to see that. Cloud at 23%, that's probably where I would have expected it, but interesting to see the hybrid clouds. I've seen lots of financial service companies, banks in particular, running hybrid because mainly risk. It seems like you're diversifying your portfolio, to put it in the financial term. If you're running a hybrid cloud, you've got something on premise, you've got something in the cloud. You're starting to go over to the cloud, and I think as we progress, you'll start to see, and executive teams will start to see over time that, we've had more outages on premise than we've had on the cloud. And so you start to get more comfortable with moving more and more into the cloud because you're seeing just no failures, and its uptime's better and its costs are better. And I think that's just a matter of time. So I'm really quite pleased to see those numbers.
So I would push back on a couple of those points. I think that one, I agree with you that I think it's good that these numbers are where they are. If you add it up, it's 65% either hybrid or cloud, and then 36% on premise. So the first thing I was thinking is, do these numbers add up to 100%? They do, roughly. I'm a firm believer that if you're doing AI on premise, you're doing it wrong. And I'm pretty hard on that point, because I think that fundamentally you're either going to be doing some training and you're going to be needing scalable infrastructure to run the training on, or you're putting it into production, and hopefully you're putting it into production and it is going to be hit, and it is going to require the ability to scale the infrastructure to support that. So folks who are like, oh, we're going to do it all in-house, I just think you don't really know AI. You don't really know what you're doing. You're messing around with some toys inside. But if you're really going to do this properly, you are going to want scalable infrastructure, and on-premises infrastructure is not truly scalable infrastructure, no matter what pseudo private cloud you think you have. You can't just spin up 100 VMs. Try it, because it'll take you 9 months. So I think that it's good that these numbers are as high as they are.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the reason these numbers are where they are, why I think it's good to see them moved, because that cloud used to be 0%, is it's taking particularly banks a long time to be able to build in their policies and their infrastructure to actually get things over onto the cloud. It's taking them time to get through the regulatory barriers.
For sure.
They're no doubt slow because they want to be very risk averse. But no, I totally agree with your point. If it's on premise, for me, it's wrong. You're going to struggle. But I do realize pragmatically, a lot of companies, banks in particular, are just still there and they're not able to move. But it should always be the first thing to do.
Yeah, and I mean, this stuff, as you know, I was involved in the cloud space, still am to some degree, but was for 13 years and watched the whole rise of it and all of the old myths. I disagree that it's necessarily more cost effective, which was a comment you made. I think that the fundamental issue is it's more flexible. It's more flexible. It's more scalable. You can spin it up. You can spin it down. It may or may not cost more, but you have much higher flexibility.
Right.
It may or may not be more secure. That just comes down to security architecture. Often the uptime is for sure higher than the internal uptime on the internal systems. So it depends.
What about things like the secure cloud, like the Amazon secure cloud?
Well, that's just it. It's all security architecture. You can secure anything well with the right architecture, and that could be cloud, or it could be on premise, or it could be a data center that's what do you call it, air gapped, so literally it doesn't have an internet connection. I mean, there are lots of ways to secure things. Cloud can be equally or more secure to your internal, but you can't necessarily say that because it's cloud it's more secure.
Okay, yeah, good point.
More secure is more secure,
right?
Not location.
So let's look at what they round up with. And for me, this was kind of the key point for me, because it reiterates many of the things that I like to talk about. And not just executives believe AI is the key to business success, because of course he would say that. He wouldn't end this with don't do it. But look at these one, two, three, four, five. And well, I like number 5 in particular, providing AI training to staff. Because, I always say that actually training is the first thing. And for me, that actually comes to number 1, because for me, it's the same point. It's having the AI expertise in-house, whether you hire it or you train it. Either way, it's about getting that expertise. So for me, those are actually the same 2 points. Although one thing I've been doing recently is training a lot of, so I'm working with one bank who initially I started off just what I usually do, which is training their leadership, but they want to spread it out right across the bank.
Right.
And the reason is they want to help the cultural change. They don't just want to force it on everybody and say, we've decided this is what you're doing. They actually want to train everybody to give them at least some understanding about what this stuff is. Because then, and what I try, and the goal I have for these people when I talk to them is to say, I want to give you the language so you can get involved in the conversation. Because ultimately, you at the front line of the business have a lot of good ideas, but you're generally excluded from the conversation because you don't know what the hell anyone's talking about. So that's interesting. And I'm seeing that as quite a change, that it's not just about leadership saying, we need to know this because we've got to decide and build a strategy. It's also saying, let's roll this out to as many people as possible so that they can get involved, become part of the conversation, or at least know what the hell this stuff is. And I think that helps also reduce internal resistance, which lots of groups tell me consistently the thing that stops them. And actually, Nvidia don't mention it here, but is internal resistance. Just other people saying, no, we don't want to change. So that for me was really interesting. They also mention identifying use cases, whatever, I think, engaging third-party partners to accelerate AI adoption. This is what we talked about previously with services. Basically, buy it, don't build it, or ideally rent it. Take someone that's already built it. Spending more on infrastructure, of course, not surprising because it's NVIDIA's report, so I'll give them that one as a freebie.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. I think providing AI training goes to the top, but I also further agree with you. It's not about the staff, it's about the entire organization. And it starts with the leadership, to your point. If the leadership doesn't know and believe and agree that this is a long-term disruptive change that is going to completely rewrite their strategy, then they won't treat it seriously. They won't fund it appropriately. And therefore you'll run into the budget issues that they talk about earlier in the page here, because there won't be enough commitment to it, because there won't be enough understanding of it. And without that understanding at the leadership level and at the staff level, then before that's in place, you can't really truly engage these third-party partners unless you use them to help upskill with training your executive team and your staff, your line folks. And you don't really want to be spending more on infrastructure and identifying use cases and hiring people until you know what this is. So the whole education piece is so critical that it's executives first, get them up to speed and get the teams up to speed. And then you have the capability and the competence to actually attract and retain, AI experts. And you wouldn't define them as AI experts. At that point, you're talking data scientists and user interface people and machine learning engineers. And you actually have more nuanced language and what you're hiring and in what order to build out your team and how to structure that team and how to organize that team. So yeah, I think the education piece is key.
So well done, NVIDIA.